I stared at the wedding invitation for what must have been 20 minutes, my coffee growing cold beside me. The ivory cardstock was thick between my fingers, the gold lettering catching the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. My sister Ellie's name, elegantly scripted alongside her fiancé's. The date, just 3 months away. The venue, our childhood hometown, a place I hadn't visited in nearly 7 years. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Ellie's familiar looping script. Please come, Nora. It would mean everything to me. How could 4 simple words carry such crushing weight? In another life, I would have immediately called her, gushing about dress shopping and bachelorette plans. But that was before everything fractured. Before our family splintered into jagged, irreconcilable pieces. Before I made the decision to cut ties with our father, and Ellie chose to maintain hers. The estrangement wasn't a sudden break, but a slow, painful unraveling that began in my late teens. My father had always been 2 different people. The charming, respected community figure everyone else knew, and the volatile, unpredictable man who existed behind closed doors. My mother absorbed the worst of it for years, shielding us as much as possible until her death when I was 14 and Ellie was 12. After that, the facade began to crumble. Dad's drinking escalated. His temper shortened. His control tightened. For me, the oldest, this meant increasingly suffocating expectations and criticism that cut to the bone. For Ellie, it manifested differently. She became the family peacekeeper, the one who could still somehow make him laugh, the daughter who knew exactly how to navigate his moods. I resented her ability to deflect his anger while I seemed to attract it like a lightning rod. Ellie often told me I just needed to know how to talk to him, her voice gentle but tinged with that subtle blame that made my skin crawl. I would counter that it shouldn't be our job to manage his emotions, increasingly aware that what was happening wasn't normal. By the time I left for college, the distance between us had grown cavernous. I emerged from our family home like a diver gasping for air after being underwater too long. With each passing semester, each new friendship formed without walking on eggshells, each relationship where disagreement didn't lead to days of icy silence, I began to understand just how damaging our home environment had been. The breaking point came during my senior year of college. I was home for Thanksgiving, one of those obligatory visits I'd endure, then spend weeks recovering from. Dad had been drinking since noon, a constant refilling of his whiskey glass that we all pretended not to notice. The tension built through dinner as he questioned every aspect of my life plans after graduation. He declared law school a waste of my time, claiming I'd never had the temperament for it, too emotional. When I mentioned that I'd already been accepted and my professors thought I'd make an excellent attorney, he scoffed. He dismissed my professors' opinions, saying they knew nothing about me. Then he called me impulsive, making decisions without thinking them through, just like my mother. The comparison to my mother, always wielded as a criticism rather than the compliment I would have taken it as, made something snap inside me. 7 years of grief and anger boiled over. I quietly but firmly defended my mother's memory, stating she was the only reason our family had functioned at all. I accused him of becoming more selfish and controlling after her death instead of stepping up. His response was to throw his whiskey glass against the wall behind me. As it shattered, Ellie flinched beside me. I didn't. He ordered me to get out. I grabbed my coat and keys, telling him I would gladly leave. Ellie followed me to the door in tears, begging me not to leave like this, insisting he didn't mean it and was just upset. I turned to her, suddenly exhausted, and asked when she would stop making excuses for him, when enough would be enough. Her only defense was that he was our dad, as if that explained and justified everything. I told her that his status as our father didn't give him the right to treat people this way, didn't obligate us to keep taking it. Her eyes hardened then, a rare flash of the stubborn core beneath her accommodating exterior. She accused me of abandoning her, leaving her to deal with everything alone. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. She was right. I was leaving her behind. But staying was destroying me, piece by piece. I admitted that I couldn't do it anymore. I loved her, but I couldn't be around him, and I couldn't keep watching her diminish herself to keep the peace. I walked out into the snow, her silhouette framed in the doorway growing smaller in my rearview mirror. The years that followed were a messy patchwork of attempted reconciliations and renewed estrangements. I finished law school, built a career defending domestic violence survivors, and created a life for myself in a city 3 states away. My relationship with Ellie continued, but changed, shifting into something cautious and strained. We met for lunch when she visited my city. We exchanged birthday and Christmas gifts. We carefully avoided discussing our father beyond the most surface-level updates. Dad's blood pressure is high, but he's taking medication now. Dad sold the boat. Dad's thinking about retiring next year. Never. Dad's still drinking too much. Dad still refuses therapy. Dad still refers to me as his difficult daughter to anyone who will listen. When I turned 30, I finally started therapy myself. The revelation that I had been carrying symptoms of complex trauma for years was both validating and devastating. My hypervigilance, perfectionism, difficulty trusting others, all of it could be traced back to growing up walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of my father I would encounter from one moment to the next. My therapist eventually asked whether maintaining distance from my father might actually be the healthiest choice for me. When I began to protest about Ellie, she gently reminded me that my sister was an adult making her own choices, just as I was making mine. It was the permission I hadn't realized I was waiting for. I stopped trying to force a relationship that brought only pain and began to accept that estrangement wasn't a failure on my part. It was self-preservation. 3 years into my estrangement from my father, Ellie called me on a random Tuesday evening to tell me she'd met someone named Marcus. Over the following months, I watched my sister transform through the lens of our video calls. The careful, anxious person I'd known began to unfurl, showing glimpses of a woman who laughed more easily and spoke her mind more freely. Marcus seemed to be the catalyst for a version of Ellie I'd never fully seen, one who wasn't constantly calibrating herself to manage someone else's emotions. 6 months into their relationship, she mentioned that Marcus wanted to meet me, saying he couldn't properly know her without knowing her sister. When I finally met Marcus over dinner in my city, I understood what she'd found in him. He listened, truly listened, when others spoke. He gently encouraged Ellie to share her opinions rather than deferring. He asked me thoughtful questions about my work and actually seemed interested in the answers. Later that night, as Ellie and I shared a bottle of wine in my apartment, I asked what our father thought of Marcus. A shadow crossed her face as she hesitated, then explained that Dad was still adjusting to the idea. Marcus wasn't someone our father could dominate in conversations the way he was used to. A year later, Marcus proposed. The joy in Ellie's voice when she called to tell me was unmistakable, but so was the undercurrent of anxiety. They wanted to get married in our hometown, in the garden at Willow Creek Inn. My silence must have spoken volumes. She quickly added that Dad had actually been making an effort, seeing a counselor at Marcus's suggestion, and surprisingly, he had agreed. I managed to say that was good, genuinely surprised but cautious. She mentioned that he asked about me, not in a manipulative way, but as if he actually regretted how things had happened. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar tug-of-war between hope and self-protection. I told her I was happy for her, truly, but didn't know if I was ready to see him yet. She expressed understanding but asked me to think about attending for her wedding, reminding me that as her only sister, she needed me there. That conversation happened 2 months ago, and now, the invitation sat before me, a gilded bridge back to a past I'd worked so hard to escape. I called my therapist first, then my closest friend, Maya. Both offered the same essential advice. I needed to decide what felt right for me, not what would please others. I needed to establish clear boundaries if I chose to attend. Maya reminded me over lunch that I'd built a life of integrity and truth-telling, and I shouldn't abandon that now. If I went, I should go as myself, not as the peacekeeper they wanted me to be. After a week of deliberation, I made my decision and called Ellie. I agreed to come to her wedding, but established conditions. I wouldn't pretend everything was fine between Dad and me or play happy family for the photos. I would be civil but authentic. I also insisted on bringing Maya as my +1. She had stood by me through years of untangling family trauma and would be my anchor. Most importantly, I wanted to meet with Dad before the wedding on neutral territory for a conversation. Not for reconciliation, but for coexistence. After a moment of silence, Ellie asked if I was sure about meeting him. I explained that if I was going to be in the same space as him for her wedding, we needed to clear the air first. She agreed, and we set the plans in motion. I would fly in a week before the wedding. We would meet at a restaurant public enough to discourage outbursts, private enough for real conversation. The restaurant Ellie chose was new since I'd left town, a farm-to-table place with exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling. I arrived 20 minutes early, ordered a glass of wine I didn't really want, and tried to slow my racing heart. When they walked in, the first thing that struck me was how much older my father looked. His hair had gone completely gray, his posture slightly stooped. He'd lost weight. For a disorienting moment, I saw him not as my tormentor but simply as an aging man. Ellie hugged me tightly, whispering thanks in my ear before taking a step back to let our father approach. We exchanged terse greetings and sat in awkward silence until the server took our orders. Ellie carried most of the conversation at first, chattering nervously about wedding details while I studied my father from behind the shield of my water glass. The tremor in his hands was new. So was the way he seemed to actually listen when Ellie spoke, nodding instead of interrupting. After our meals arrived, he finally addressed me directly, noting that according to Ellie, I was doing well, now a partner at my firm. When I confirmed this, he called it impressive, remarking that I had always been determined. I noted how he'd reframed my supposed stubbornness as determination now that it had led to success. Ellie excused herself to the restroom, a transparent attempt to give us privacy that I both appreciated and dreaded. In her absence, my father stared down at his barely touched salmon and mentioned he'd been seeing a therapist, saying the word awkwardly, as if it were in a foreign language. He explained it was part of his recovery program. When I echoed the word recovery questioningly, he revealed he'd been sober for 14 months, acknowledging it was too late for many things. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to congratulate him. Another part felt a surge of anger. Why now? Why not when we needed him to be sober, when Mom was dying, when we were children who deserved a present father? He commented that Ellie had told him about my work helping women in bad situations, like our mother had been in. The direct acknowledgement of what our home life had been knocked the air from my lungs. For so long, the unspoken rule had been to never name it, never admit what we all knew. I managed to confirm that was my specialty, and he nodded slowly, saying my mother would have been proud. The mention of my mother from his lips threatened to crack the careful composure I'd maintained. He continued, admitting he'd been a terrible husband to her and wasn't the father we deserved. The admission hung between us, inadequate yet monumental from a man who had never before acknowledged his failures. I quietly agreed that he hadn't been, causing him to flinch though he nodded in acknowledgement. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted to say it to my face, that he was wrong about a lot of things. When Ellie returned, she found us in silence, but something had shifted. Not forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that and might never be, but a tiny fracture in the wall I'd built. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. I stayed at a hotel rather than at our old home, maintaining the distance I needed. Ellie respected this choice, meeting me for breakfast and bringing me into the wedding preparations without pushing for more family time than I could handle. Maya arrived 3 days before the ceremony, her steady presence a balm for my frayed nerves. She approached Ellie with instant warmth that seemed to surprise my sister. When Maya mentioned she felt like she already knew Ellie because I talked about her all the time, Ellie looked at me with surprise, asking if I really spoke about her. Maya confirmed I did, frequently, and that I was incredibly proud of her. The startled pleasure on Ellie's face made me realize how much our strained relationship had convinced her that my distance meant a lack of care. Nothing could be further from the truth. I had built walls to protect myself from our father, but Ellie had felt walled out too. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner, which my father and I navigated with careful civility, Ellie asked me to come to her hotel room. Marcus was staying with his brothers, honoring their decision to spend the night before the wedding apart. She presented me with a wrapped package from her suitcase. Inside was a framed photograph I'd never seen before, Mom in her garden, laughing at the camera with a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a teenage me beside her, gangly and unself-conscious in a way I barely remembered being. In the background, a 7-year-old Ellie was visible, focused intently on a flower. When I asked where she'd found it, she explained she'd been digitizing Mom's old albums and wanted me to have this one. As I traced my mother's face through the glass, commenting on how happy she looked, Ellie's tone became serious. She apologized for making me feel like I was overreacting for years, for making me feel like I was the problem. She admitted she had sided with Dad because it was easier, because she was afraid. When I tried to interject, she insisted on finishing. She explained that she hadn't understood back then what I was trying to protect her from. After I left, things got worse for a while with Dad's drinking and moods, and she started to see what I'd been seeing all along. I reached for her hand, squeezing it as she continued. She revealed that meeting Marcus had shown her the difference between love and control, between respect and fear. She realized I had been trying to show her that difference for years. Tears welled in my eyes as I confessed that never wanting to leave her behind had been the hardest part. She acknowledged that now, wishing she'd been brave enough to stand with me back then. I reminded her that we were both children then, doing the best we could with what we had. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken years between us finally beginning to lift. Eventually, I asked if she was okay with Dad walking her down the aisle the next day. She nodded slowly, explaining that he was different now, not perfect, but trying. For her, it felt like closure, a page turning. When I asked if she was truly happy with Marcus, her face transformed, years of tension melting away. She confirmed she was, saying Marcus saw all of her, even the parts she thought were too much or not enough. I recognized in her words the same healing I'd found in my own journey, learning that the warped mirror our father had held up to us wasn't reality, that we were worthy of being seen and loved completely. I told her I was happy for her, meaning it entirely, and that she deserved this. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the garden venue awash in late spring blossoms. I watched from the bridal suite window as guests arrived, my father greeting them with the charming public persona he'd always worn so easily. But today, there seemed to be less distance between that self and the man I'd glimpsed at the restaurant, older, humbler, grappling with his past. As maid of honor, I stood at the altar while the music began. My father appeared with Ellie on his arm, her face radiant behind her veil. He kissed her cheek before placing her hand in Marcus's, then turned briefly toward me. Our eyes met, and he gave a slight nod, acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even a tinge of regret. During the reception, I gave my speech, focusing on Ellie's strength, her capacity for compassion, her journey to find herself. I spoke of our mother and how proud she would be. I did not manufacture false sentimentality about our perfect family. I spoke truth wrapped in love. Later, as the dancing began, my father approached where Maya and I stood near the edge of the dance floor. He asked Maya if he could borrow me for a moment. After I nodded my approval, she stepped away, remaining within eyesight, my silent guardian. My father clarified he wasn't asking for a dance, just wanted to thank me for being there for Ellie. I replied that I'd never miss my sister's wedding. He nodded, hands clasped behind his back, and commented that my speech had been beautiful and honest. I simply stated that's who I was now. I didn't pretend anymore. He acknowledged he deserved that, adding that for what it was worth, he was trying to learn honesty too, suggesting better late than never. I didn't disagree, but didn't comfort him either. His journey toward accountability was his own to walk. He mentioned that Ellie had told him I wouldn't be at Christmas this year because I was going to Peru. When I confirmed this was a 2-week hiking trip I'd always wanted to do, he nodded thoughtfully. Then he shared that my mother had always wanted to travel more, but he had discouraged it. This admission surprised me. He elaborated that she had kept a whole box of travel magazines, and Machu Picchu had been on her list too. This new piece of my mother, this desire I'd somehow inherited without knowing it had been hers too, hit me with unexpected force. When I softly remarked that I hadn't known that, he acknowledged there was a lot he'd kept from both of us, but was trying to do better now. We both gazed across the reception to where Ellie was dancing with Marcus, laughing as he twirled her. I commented that she seemed really happy, and he agreed. Then he turned back to me with an unexpected question. Was I happy? It struck me as genuine interest in my well-being without agenda or comparison. When was the last time he had asked me something like that and actually wanted to hear the answer? I answered truthfully that I was getting there, that I'd build a good life. He expressed gladness, then hesitantly added that if I ever wanted to talk again, just talk, no pressure, he'd like that, but understood if that wasn't what I wanted. The invitation hung between us, not a demand, not manipulation, but an open door I could choose to walk through or not. I admitted I didn't know yet, but would think about it. He accepted this with a nod, then excused himself, leaving me with thoughts I hadn't expected to have at my sister's wedding, not reconciliation, exactly, but perhaps the first tentative steps towards something new. Not the erasing of the past, but the possibility of a future not entirely defined by it. 2 days after the wedding, Maya and I packed our bags for the flight home. Ellie and Marcus had already left for their honeymoon in Greece. My father and I had exchanged cautious goodbyes at the post-wedding brunch, neither of us certain when or if we would see each other again. As we drove to the airport, we passed the turnoff to my childhood home. On impulse, I signaled and turned down the familiar street. Maya gently asked if I was sure about this. I assured her it would just be for a minute. The house looked smaller than I remembered, The once vibrant garden my mother had tended now replaced with low-maintenance shrubs. I didn't get out of the car, just sat in the driveway looking at the place that had shaped so much of who I'd become, both the trauma and the resilience. After a few minutes of silence, Maya remarked that what she admired most about me was that I'd never used my past as an excuse to be less than I am, but as fuel to become more. When I asked what she meant, she explained that some people who've experienced what I have shut down, building walls so high no one can reach them. Others use their pain as justification to hurt others. But I had become an advocate, created boundaries without becoming cold, remained open to love. She said that takes extraordinary courage. Her words settled over me like a mantle, not erasing the hardship, but reframing it as part of a larger story still being written. As we pulled away from the house, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't there yet. Might never fully be, but perhaps a kind of acceptance. Acceptance that my family, like most, was neither entirely good nor entirely bad. That people could cause deep harm and still be capable of change. That I could honor my boundaries while remaining open to possibility. I asked Maya if she thought I should try with my father. She considered this carefully, saying it was entirely up to me, that there was no should here. Either choice could be the right one if made for the right reasons. When I asked what the right reasons were, she explained. My well-being, not guilt, not obligation, not anyone else's expectations. Whatever I decided needed to be because it was what was healthiest for me, not what would make the story neater for everyone else. I nodded, watching the landscape of my hometown recede in the rearview mirror. I didn't have all the answers yet. I didn't know if the fragile bridge that had begun to form between my father and me would bear weight or collapse. I didn't know if his changes were temporary or lasting. What I did know was that I was no longer the frightened young woman who had fled this town 7 years ago. I had built a life on my own terms. I had reclaimed my relationship with my sister. I had learned that boundaries were not walls but the foundations of healthy connection. And perhaps that was enough for now, not a neatly tied ending, but an ongoing story of healing that belonged to me alone. Does forgiveness require forgetting? Is reconciliation always the right path? Or is there sometimes more courage in maintaining distance while still wishing someone well from afar? I don't have a simple answer. Only the knowledge that whatever comes next, I'll face it as myself, whole and undiminished, scarred but not broken, defined not by what happened to me but by what I choose to do with it.